We're now going to study how the change in the price of a good can have an impact, which can be decomposed in an income effect and a substitution effect. This is called the Hicks decomposition. First, let's review what we know regarding the optimal consumption points. So we know that the consumer's optimal choice is constrained by her budget. Her budget constraint has the following equation, and the slope of the budget line is equal to the ratio of prices. The consumer has an indifference curve. This indifference curve, you might also read in different textbooks, sometimes it's called the ISO utility line. This indifference curve has a slope which is equal to the marginal rate of substitution. At the optimum, the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the price ratio. All right, this slide you must absolutely know and understand. Given these properties, now we're going to see what happens when the price of a good increases. And we're going to see that two effects are at play. First of all, when the price of one good increases, there's an increase in the relative price. So the price ratio changes because one of the goods has its price that has changed. Second, because one good has become more expensive, that means that there's a decrease in the purchasing power. You can buy fewer goods, and the area below the budget line is smaller. So the budget line is going to pivot inside or towards the left because now one of the goods has become more expensive. So we're going to decompose these two effects. This is called the Hicks decomposition. First of all, we're going to see that there's a substitution effect. So the substitution effect corresponds to a changing price ratio, leaving the initial utility unchanged. So that means that when one good has become more expensive, the consumer is going to start increasing the consumption in the other good whose price hasn't changed. Then there's the income effect. The income effect reflects the relative price change. So that's going to show how purchasing power has actually dropped. So on this graph, we're going to start off from the initial point P1, and that's the original consumption point. Moving from P1 to P2 shows the compensated demand. So that's the substitution effect. We're not looking at the change in real income. We're now looking at the change in the new relative price. So the line that's going to go through P2 is going to reflect the new ratio of prices. It basically shows how the consumer is going to start consuming less of good C and more of good B because the consumer is substituting these two goods following the increase in the price of C. But the price of B hasn't changed. So we're going to move from P2 to P3. That's going to help us draw the new budget line. So the new budget line has a slope that is equal to the new price ratio. So the new budget line is that red solid line which is parallel to the dotted red line. And moving from P2 to P3, that shows the income effect. That shows what happens because we have a drop in purchasing power. So moving from P1 to P2, that shows that the consumer wants to consume more of good B and less of good C. But the thing is that the real income of the consumer has actually changed. So to reflect that change in real income, that's the moving from point P2 to P3. And you can observe that at point P3, the consumer is actually consuming less of good B and less of good C compared to the original situation, which was P1. So the original situation is P1. The final optimal consumption point is now going to be P3. The point P2 just helps us decompose between the substitution effect and the income effect. So moving from P1 to P2, we change the slope of the budget constraint, staying on the same indifference curve. This is the substitution effect. It shows compensated demand. Then moving from P2 to P3, we draw the parallel line to reach the new budget line. This is the income effect. We're not looking at the compensation of demand. We're looking at now the impact of the new real income, the fact that now the consumer can actually consume less of both goods because because the price of C has increased.